It was a quiet autumn evening when 8-year-old Lily wandered too far from home. The golden fields behind her house stretched endlessly, swaying in the crisp wind. She wasn't supposed to be out this late, but something had drawn her toward the old, abandoned barn at the edge of the woods. No one went there anymore, not since the fire. The barn stood in eerie silence, its charred wooden beams barely holding together, leaning as if whispering secrets to the night. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. As she took a cautious step forward, a cold breeze sent a shiver down her spine. That's when she saw it. A lone horse stood just beyond the broken fence, motionless. Its coat was dull and matted, its ribs pressing against its skin. The animal looked weak, barely breathing, yet its dark eyes locked onto Lily's with an intensity that sent her heart racing. It wasn't just looking at her. It was staring through her, like it recognized her, like it had been waiting. Lily hesitated. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. A strange silence settled around her, thick and unnatural. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her trembled. The wooden planks of the barn creaked and groaned, as if something inside was stirring. A deep, distant rumble rose from beneath the earth, vibrating through her bones. The horse didn't move. It simply kept watching her, its breath visible in the chilling air. And then, it took one step forward. That's when she heard it, a whisper. Not from the wind, not from the trees, but from beneath the earth. And that's when she knew she wasn't alone. The air felt heavier now, thick with a silence that didn't belong. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting deep shadows across the abandoned barn. The wooden structure loomed in the fading twilight, its skeletal frame twisted and broken, as if something had clawed its way out long ago. The breeze had died, leaving only the sound of Lily's uneven breathing. She swallowed hard, stepping forward despite the tight knot forming in her stomach. The ground beneath her feet was dry and cracked, littered with withered leaves and forgotten debris. Every step felt wrong, like she was intruding on something that wanted to be left undisturbed. The barn doors hung slightly open, swaying just enough to let out a faint creak, a whisper against the silence. The horse still hadn't moved, except for the slow rise and fall of its ribs. Its eyes glowed softly in the dim light, watching her every move. There was something unnatural about the way it stood, rigid, expectant, as if it was waiting for her to do something. Lily's fingers trembled as she reached out, but just as her foot scraped against a loose stone, the earth trembled again. This time it was stronger. The barn groaned, dust trickling from its rafters. Somewhere in the distance, a lone crow let out a shrill cry before the night swallowed it whole. A whisper brushed past her ear. Lily spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The trees stood still, the sky empty. But deep in the darkness of the barn, something shifted. She wasn't just being watched. She was being called. Lily had always been drawn to things that others feared. She wasn't reckless, but she had an insatiable curiosity, the kind that made her linger in places she shouldn't. At just 12 years old, she had an imagination that ran wild, sometimes too wild, her mother would say. But she wasn't imagining things now. The abandoned barn had stood on the outskirts of town for as long as she could remember. It was the kind of place that parents warned their children about, where stories of strange occurrences turned into urban legends. But Lily had never paid attention to warnings. Something about the place fascinated her. Tonight, that fascination had turned into something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain. She had first noticed the horse a week ago. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast against the ruins of the barn. But then it moved. It had been standing there ever since, never wandering, never eating, just staring. She had told herself she wouldn't come back, but the pull had been too strong. Now, standing just a few feet away, she could see it up close. Its coat was matted with dirt, its ribs protruding against its frail body. The once powerful creature looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But its eyes, they held something else. Not just pain, not just sorrow. There was intelligence, recognition, as if it had been waiting for her. Lily, "Don't go near it," came a voice from behind her. She turned sharply. Jacob, her older brother, stood at the edge of the path, his arms crossed tightly. At 16, he had perfected the role of overprotective sibling, always warning her against the risks she willingly walked into. "You followed me?" she asked, annoyance creeping into her voice. "You weren't exactly subtle," Jacob shot back. "Mom's going to kill you if she finds out you snuck out again." Lily turned back to the horse. "Something's wrong with it. It's been here for days. That's because it's probably sick. Or worse." Jacob's tone was firm, but there was unease in his eyes. He had always acted fearless, but Lily knew better. He had heard the stories too, the ones about the barn, about the things that lurked there. A sudden gust of wind rustled through the trees, sending a chill down Lily's spine. The horse's ears flicked forward, its body tensing. Then, without warning, it let out a deep, guttural noise, something between a whimper and a growl. Jacob grabbed Lily's arm. "We need to go. Now." But she couldn't move. The ground beneath her trembled again, harder this time. The barn doors creaked wider, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And in that darkness, something moved. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the ground beneath her trembled again, sending tiny vibrations up her legs. She glanced at Jacob, whose eyes darted toward the barn, his face paler than she had ever seen. The old wooden structure groaned, its worn beams creaking like the ribs of a sleeping giant about to wake. The horse remained still, staring directly at Lily, unblinking, unmoving. "Lily, we have to go," Jacob hissed, his grip tightening around her wrist. But she barely registered his words. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the horse's eyes, dark pools filled with something more than fear. It was as if it wanted her to understand something. Then the shaking stopped. The barn fell silent. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing against their skin, making every sound unnaturally loud. Even the wind had vanished. Lily's heart pounded in her ears. And then the whisper came. At first, it was just a breath of sound, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind shifting through the broken wooden slats. But as it grew, it became unmistakable. A voice, low, pleading, desperate. "Help me." Lily's blood turned to ice. She whipped her head toward Jacob, whose expression confirmed that he had heard it too. The horse let out a sharp snort, its hooves stomping against the dirt. Its ears flicked forward, then back, as if responding to the unseen presence. "Lily, we are leaving. Now." Jacob yanked her back, his fear now unmasked. But just as she took a step, the barn doors slammed open with a deafening bang. The darkness inside was thick, swirling like a living thing. Something shifted within the shadows, a shape, tall, thin, with jagged edges like broken glass. It moved toward them with unnatural fluidity, its body flickering between solid and transparent. Lily stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. "Jacob, I see it," he whispered, pulling her behind him. He wasn't acting tough anymore. He was terrified. The shape advanced, its form glitching, distorting like a corrupted image. The voice came again, but this time it was everywhere, inside their heads, pressing against their skulls. She was left behind, forgotten, trapped. Lily's eyes snapped to the horse. It stood perfectly still, its gaze locked on the shadow. The moment stretched unbearably, and then, in a movement so sudden it blurred, the horse bolted toward the darkness. "No!" Lily screamed, but it was too late. The instant the horse crossed the threshold, the barn let out an ear-splitting groan. The shaking returned, more violent this time. The ground beneath them cracked, splitting like fragile glass. Jacob grabbed her hand, dragging her away from the barn as the air filled with dust and splintering wood. The structure was collapsing, folding in on itself, as if being swallowed by the earth. The shadow twisted and writhed, letting out an unholy shriek. And then silence. The barn was gone. No ruins, no debris. Just a stretch of undisturbed earth where it once stood. The horse was gone too. Lily stood frozen, her body shaking. "Jacob, what just happened?" He swallowed hard, staring at the empty space. I don't know, but Lily did. The horse wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting, and now it was finally free. But before either of them could process what had happened, the silence was shattered once more. A deep, resonant rumble echoed beneath them, making the dirt tremble. Jacob took a step back, yanking Lily with him. The spot where the barn had stood was no longer just empty. It was sinking. A hole, dark and gaping, widened in the earth, swallowing the last remnants of the cursed place. The air felt charged, thick with something ancient. A faint, ghostly glow emanated from within the pit, casting eerie shadows on their faces. Jacob pulled Lily back further. We need to go. Right now. Lily hesitated, her eyes drawn to the hole as if something inside was calling her. And then movement. A skeletal hand, covered in rotting flesh, reached up from the depths. Lily choked on a scream, stumbling backward. Jacob grabbed her arm, practically dragging her as they sprinted toward the tree line. The ground behind them groaned and shifted, as if something massive was clawing its way to the surface. The whisper returned, only this time it was stronger, angrier. You should not have come. Lily's legs burned as they ran. The air around them grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. She risked a glance over her shoulder, and immediately wished she hadn't. The figure from the barn was emerging, its long, jagged limbs pulling it free from the pit. Its face was a shifting void, flickering between a skull and something else. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something worse. Jacob reached their bikes first, fumbling with the handlebars in his panic. Come on. Come on. Lily leaped onto her own, pedaling harder than she ever had in her life. The shadow loomed behind them, stretching unnaturally as it gave chase. The road was bumpy, uneven, but she didn't dare slow down. Only when they were halfway back to town did the presence finally fade. The air warmed. The oppressive weight lifted from their shoulders. Jacob finally stopped, panting, his face slick with sweat. Lily, what was that? She shook her head, still trembling. I don't know, but I don't think it's over. And deep down, she knew she was right, because as they stared back toward the distant woods, the last thing they saw was a pair of glowing eyes watching, waiting, and the ground beneath them trembled once more. Lily's breath remained shallow as she and Jacob coasted their bikes down the dirt road, the wind against her face doing little to cool the fire of panic still burning inside her. The town wasn't far, but each second stretched unbearably long, every rustling leaf and distant hoot of an owl amplifying her unease. Jacob rode ahead, his grip white-knuckled on the handlebars. He hadn't spoken since they fled the barn, not since they saw it. Jacob, Lily finally croaked, her throat raw from the screaming. Did you see its face? Jacob's head snapped toward her, his expression unreadable in the dim moonlight. I don't want to talk about it. We have to, she insisted, her voice trembling. It saw us. It was real. Jacob's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced back toward the woods, now a dark, silent mass behind them. Then he slowed his bike to a stop. Lily hesitated before pulling up beside him. What are you doing? Jacob exhaled sharply and dragged a shaking hand through his hair. Lily, that horse wasn't just staring at you. It was warning you. Lily's stomach tightened. Warning me? Jacob nodded, eyes darting around as if making sure they were alone. When we first saw it, I thought, maybe it was just abandoned. But the way it looked at you, it wasn't scared. It was desperate. He swallowed hard. And when that thing came out of the barn, it ran straight at it. Like it knew what it had to do. Lily's heart pounded. The horse, it hadn't been running away. It had been running toward something, confronting it. She shivered as another thought struck her. But if the horse was keeping it there, and now it's gone, Jacob paled. Then what's stopping it from coming after us? A gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying a sound that made both of them freeze. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, coming from behind them. Lily's blood turned to ice. She turned her head slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The road behind them was empty, but the sound was still there, growing louder, closer. Jacob grabbed her wrist. We have to move. Now. They jumped back onto their bikes, pedaling furiously. The trees blurred past them, the wind roaring in their ears. The sound of hooves echoed behind them, steady, relentless. Lily risked a glance back. There was nothing there. No horse, no shadow, just the road stretching into darkness. But the sound of galloping hooves hadn't stopped. Her mind raced. Was it in her head? A trick of fear? Or was it something worse? Something unseen? Jacob, do you hear that? She gasped. Yes, he snapped. Just keep riding. The road curved sharply ahead. The old cemetery loomed in the distance, its rusted gate barely visible in the moonlight. And then, the hooves stopped. Dead silence. Lily and Jacob skidded to a halt, their breathing ragged. The air felt thick again, heavy. Then a whisper, low, faint, right next to Lily's ear. You, let it out. A scream tore from her throat as she lurched away from the unseen voice. Jacob grabbed her, his own face stricken with terror. A cold breath of air brushed against the back of her neck. Something was standing behind her. She could feel it. She turned. Nothing. But then Jacob gasped. Lily followed his gaze toward the cemetery, and she saw them. Faint, glowing shapes standing among the graves. Watching. The whispers grew, overlapping, a chorus of desperate voices. Trapped, buried, forgotten. A shadow moved between the graves, slipping through the mist like a phantom. Lily's knees nearly buckled. Jacob, what is this? I don't know, he whispered, voice barely audible. But we have to leave. He reached for her hand, but before he could pull her away, the ground beneath them trembled again. And then the hoofbeats returned. But this time they weren't behind them. They were coming from the cemetery. Lily's pulse thundered in her ears as she and Jacob stood frozen at the cemetery's edge. The mist curled around the gravestones, shifting like phantom hands reaching out. The whispering voices had stopped, but the silence was far worse. It felt like the world had exhaled, waiting for something unseen to inhale once more. A brittle wind howled through the trees, carrying a scent of damp earth and decay. Lily shivered, rubbing her arms. Jacob, do you feel that? She whispered. Jacob nodded stiffly, like we're being watched. Lily swallowed hard. She wasn't sure when the feeling had started, but it was as if unseen eyes had been following them from the moment they entered the graveyard. Every time she turned her head, she expected to see something lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. Then came the sound, a slow, rhythmic thumping. At first, she thought it was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. But no, this was external. It was distant but growing closer. The heavy thud, thud, thud of hooves striking the ground. Jacob stiffened. Do you hear that? Lily nodded, her breath hitching. The sound was unnatural, slow, deliberate, like something moving through molasses. She could feel the vibrations beneath her feet, a steady tremor in the earth. But there was nothing there. No horse, no figure, just the empty, mist-laden graveyard stretching before them. Then the first grave shifted. The soil trembled, rippling outward like something was stirring beneath the ground. Lily took a step back, her throat dry. Jacob! Another grave shuddered. Then another. The whispers returned, urgent now. A chorus of disembodied voices overlapping in a language she didn't understand. But one word echoed in her mind, clear as a bell. Run. A cold hand clamped around her wrist. She gasped, jerking away, only to realize it was Jacob, his face pale as death. We have to go, he rasped. Now. But her feet refused to move. Her gaze was locked on the graves, on the fingers of blackened bone now clawing their way out of the soil. The wind picked up, howling between the headstones like a shriek of warning. Then laughter. It was distant at first, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably human. A man's voice, deep and guttural, laced with amusement. It sent a chill racing down Lily's spine. Jacob yanked her arm. Lily, move. Finally, her legs obeyed. They bolted from the cemetery, the laughter echoing behind them, twisting into something unnatural. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere resisted their escape. As they reached the edge of the trees, Lily risked one last glance over her shoulder. The graveyard was no longer empty. A figure stood among the tombstones, watching them. Tall and gaunt, wrapped in a tattered cloak that fluttered despite the still air. Its face was hidden beneath a deep hood, but Lily could feel its gaze burning into her. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, it raised a skeletal hand and pointed straight at her. A wave of nausea crashed over her. Her vision swam. She stumbled, and Jacob caught her before she hit the ground. "Lily? What's wrong?" She struggled to breathe, her mind spinning. Images flickered in her head, of the barn, of the symbols, of something ancient waiting to be freed. A memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp. A book. She had read about this before. The legend of the Hollow Rider, a spirit bound by an ancient pact, could only be freed by one thing: recognition. Lily's blood ran cold. She had seen it, acknowledged it, and now it knew her. The laughter returned, closer this time. The hooves started again, steady and deliberate. The trees around them twisted unnaturally, their shadows stretching as if reaching for her. Jacob's voice was distant, muffled. "Lily, what's happening? Talk to me." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The rider stepped forward. The ground beneath its feet darkened, rotting away. With every movement, the world around them warped. The air crackled with something old, something wrong. Jacob followed her gaze and went rigid. "What the hell is that?" Lily barely heard him. Her mind was racing, searching for a way out. If the legends were true, there was still a chance. A way to break the connection before it was too late. She grabbed Jacob's arm. "We can't let it follow us." His eyes were wild. "How do we stop it?" Lily inhaled sharply. There was only one way. They had to return to the barn, because that was where it had been trapped before. And if they didn't act fast, it would never be trapped again. The pounding of unseen hooves grew deafening, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Lily and Jacob sprinted through the thick, gnarled trees, their breath coming in sharp gasps. The darkness behind them pulsed and swayed, twisting unnaturally as if the night itself was alive. The Hollow Rider was closing in. Lily's mind raced. The legend had said the rider was bound by an ancient pact. But what did that mean? How had it been sealed away before? The barn. It had to be the barn. That was where it started, where they had first seen the markings. If they could get back, maybe they could figure out how to lock it away again. "Jacob, we need to get to the barn," she shouted, her voice nearly drowned by the thunderous galloping. Jacob didn't question her. He only nodded and pushed forward, dodging roots and low-hanging branches as they tore through the woods. The barn loomed in the distance, its weathered frame barely visible through the mist. A heavy pressure bore down on Lily's chest, as if unseen hands were trying to hold her back. Then the temperature dropped. A piercing screech tore through the air, sending an icy dagger of fear through her spine. The rider was close, too close. She could hear its voice now, a deep, guttural whisper that slithered through her mind. "You see me?" Lily's legs nearly gave out. The weight of its presence pressed against her skull, like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Then Jacob grabbed her hand. "Come on!" With a final desperate sprint, they reached the barn. Jacob shoved the doors open, and they stumbled inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air became thick, charged with something ancient and heavy. The walls groaned as if the building itself had memory. Lily's gaze shot to the floorboards. The symbols, they were still there, carved deep into the wood, glowing faintly in the dim light. A wave of realization crashed over her. These weren't just markings. They were a seal. Something had locked the rider away before, and they had broken it. Jacob followed her gaze. "Lily, what do we do?" Lily swallowed hard. "We have to restore it." Jacob paled. "How? We don't even know what it means." A sudden gust of wind blasted through the barn, slamming the doors shut. The light flickered, the ground trembled, and then the rider was inside. It loomed at the entrance, its skeletal form draped in tattered shadows, a void where its face should have been. Its presence sucked the warmth from the air, filling the space with a silence so deep it was suffocating. Lily's fingers clenched into fists. They had one chance. She dropped to her knees, tracing the symbols with her hands, trying to remember how they had looked before. Behind her, Jacob stood frozen. The rider stepped forward, the floor groaning under its weight. "Your name," it whispered. "Give it to me." Lily's blood ran cold. She had read about this before. Giving a name meant surrendering. The moment she answered, she would belong to it. Her hands shook as she traced the last missing piece of the symbol. The rider took another step. Jacob moved. In one swift motion, he grabbed the rusty shovel leaning against the wall and swung it, aiming straight for the rider's chest. The moment the metal connected, an ear-splitting shriek filled the air. The shadows around the creature recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. It wasn't invincible. "Keep it distracted," Lily yelled, frantically scraping the last of the symbols into the wood. Jacob didn't hesitate. He grabbed a broken lantern from the floor and hurled it at the creature. It shattered, flames licking up the edges of the barn. The rider twisted violently, its form shifting between solid and spectral. Lily pressed her hand to the final mark. "Be sealed," she screamed. The moment the words left her lips, the symbols blazed with blinding light. A powerful force rippled through the barn, slamming into the rider. It let out a deafening wail, clawing at the air as its body convulsed. The shadows around it cracked like glass. Then it was gone. The barn fell into eerie silence. The wind had stopped. The cold, suffocating presence had vanished. Lily slumped forward, her breath ragged. Jacob collapsed beside her. Did we do it?" Lily nodded weakly. "I think so." The symbols on the floor glowed one last time before fading into the wood. The seal was restored. Outside, the first rays of dawn peeked over the horizon. The night was over. The rider was gone. But as Lily stared at the floor, a single, unsettling thought crept into her mind. The seal had been there before, which meant someone had broken it once before. And one day, someone might break it again. The sun had fully risen by the time Lily and Jacob stepped out of the barn, their bodies aching, their minds exhausted. The morning light felt almost unreal, too warm, too normal after the nightmare they had survived. The air smelled of damp wood and smoke from the shattered lantern, but the weight that had pressed down on them all night was gone. The hollow rider was sealed once more. Lily exhaled slowly, glancing back at the barn. The markings had disappeared, as if they had never existed. But she knew better. The seal had been broken before, could be broken again. Jacob ran a hand through his messy hair, staring at the sky. "Do you think it's really over?" Lily didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the scar on her wrist, an injury from when she had first stumbled into this mystery. She had learned something that night, something terrifying and undeniable. There were things in the world that couldn't be explained, and some doors, once opened, never truly closed. "Maybe," she said finally. "For now." Jacob gave her a wary look. "That's not exactly reassuring." Lily forced a small smile. "We stopped it this time. That's what matters." But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't truly over. As they walked away from the barn, Lily thought about the nature of fear, how it could consume, but also how it could sharpen. They had faced something unimaginable and survived. They weren't the same people who had walked into those woods. And yet, a single truth lingered in her mind. Some nightmares don't die. They just wait. If you enjoyed this spine-chilling story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more eerie tales that will keep you up at night. What do you think really happened that night? Was the hollow rider truly sealed? Or is it just waiting for its next victim? Drop your theories in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. And if you love stories filled with mystery, horror, and suspense, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss our next terrifying upload. There are more dark secrets lurking just around the corner, and you won't want to miss them. Until next time, stay curious. And stay cautious. You never know what's watching from the shadows.